The Great Depression was a severe global economic downturn that began in 1929 and lasted until the late 1930s. It was caused by a combination of factors, including the collapse of the stock market, economic inequality, and poor policy decisions by central banks. One of the key contributing factors was the use of the gold standard, a monetary system in which the value of a currency is directly linked to a fixed amount of gold. This system placed strict limitations on the ability of governments to print money, which made it difficult for them to respond to economic downturns. Central banks in the United States, Britain, Germany, and France made mistakes such as lowering interest rates and refusing to abandon the gold standard. In 1914, the gold standard was used in 59 countries and was seen as the traditional foundation of the monetary system. The concept of central bank was also a new innovation, especially in the United States. America was turning into a financial and industrial center, but regularly experienced bursts of financial panic. In 1907, J.P. Morgan & Co. played the role of a central bank during a massive withdrawal of bank deposits. American bankers, economists, and politicians were interested in having an organization to fight financial crises, but they were hesitant to centralize. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, creating a council of 12 regional offices. The most influential of these was the New York branch of the Fed, headed by Benjamin Strong. Strong was one of the four central bankers who played a key role in the approach of the Great Depression. The other three were Montague Norman from Britain, Émile Moreau from France, and Hjalmar Schacht from Germany. On the eve of World War I, gold was considered the most important financial asset of banks. To anticipate the enormous costs of warfare, the German Reichsbank amassed $500 million in gold, the Bank of England $200 million, and the Bank of France $800 million. Many French citizens kept gold coins under their mattresses. During the war, the central bank suspended the gold standard. After the war, the central banks resumed the gold standard, but it was no longer sufficient to support the expanded money supply. The Fed, Bank of England, and Bank of France held a significant amount of gold reserves, while the German Reichsbank did not. As a result, the German mark was heavily devalued and led to hyperinflation. The devaluation of the German mark made German goods cheaper to foreign buyers, boosting their exports. However, it also led to a loss of trust in the currency and made it difficult for the German government to borrow money. In the United States, the Fed kept interest rates low to support economic recovery, but it also led to speculation in the stock market. The stock market crash of 1929 was the beginning of the Great Depression. The Fed initially responded to the crash by raising interest rates, which made the crisis worse. Other central banks also raised interest rates and refused to abandon the gold standard, further exacerbating the crisis. The gold standard made it difficult for governments to respond to the crisis by printing money. The economic downturn led to mass unemployment, falling stock prices, and exchange rates. In Germany, the devaluation of the mark led to hyperinflation, making it difficult for citizens to afford basic goods. In the United States, people did not trust banks and kept money by burying it in their backyards. The crisis reached its peak in the early 1930s during the Great Depression. Banks' reluctance to abandon the gold standard was one of the major mistakes that led to the Great Depression. The collapse of the stock market, economic inequality, and poor policy decisions by central banks also contributed to the crisis. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 in the United States brought together 12 regional offices under a single council, the most influential of which was the New York branch headed by Benjamin Strong. Strong played a key role in the approach of the Great Depression along with other central bankers from Britain, France, and Germany. The gold standard was initially seen as a traditional foundation for the monetary system, but it proved inadequate to deal with the economic crisis. The gold standard contained inflation but could not solve other economic problems. The economies of the developed Western countries were heavily impacted by the Great Depression. The downturn had a ripple effect and led to economic downturns in many other countries. The Great Depression resulted in widespread poverty and suffering across the globe. The gold standard played a role in the Great Depression by limiting the ability of governments to print money and respond to economic downturns. The mistakes made by central banks in the United States, Britain, Germany, and France were significant contributors to the crisis. The Fed and other central banks' reluctance to abandon the gold standard further exacerbated the crisis. The Great Depression was a direct result of the mistakes made by the central banks of the four leading powers at the time. The Great Depression had severe and long-lasting effects on the global economy and society. The gold standard played a key role in the onset of the Great Depression. Central banks' poor policy decisions further contributed to the severity of the crisis. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 in the United States created a council of 12 regional offices which played a critical role in the approach of the Great Depression. Benjamin Strong, head of the New York branch of the Fed, was one of the key central bankers who played a role in the onset of the Great Depression. The actions of other central bankers from Britain, France, and Germany also contributed to the crisis. The gold standard had outlived its usefulness by the time of the Great Depression. The Great Depression led to widespread poverty and suffering. The use of the gold standard made it difficult for governments to respond to the economic crisis. The Great Depression was caused by a combination of factors including poor policy decisions by central banks, economic inequality, and the collapse of the stock market. Central banks played a major role in the onset and severity of the Great Depression. The gold standard was seen as a traditional foundation of the monetary system, but it failed to prevent or mitigate the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 in the United States created a system of regional offices that played a critical role in the approach of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had a lasting impact on the global economy and society. The causes of the Great Depression have been widely studied and analyzed, and lessons from the crisis have been used to inform economic policy.